There are stories whispered across the Imperium that never reach a data slate, never pass an inquisitor's scrutiny, and never leave the trembling lips of the soldiers who survived long enough to remember them. They are spoken in the cold hours before dawn, when the void outside the hab windows feels hungrier than usual, and the candles beside the regimental shrines burn with a strange, wavering flame. They speak of a single presence, not an army, not a crusade, but a lone ascending nightmare draped in warp light, a demon prince whose shadow can swallow entire civilizations long before his talons ever touch soil. To some, he is a curse given shape. To others, a myth told to frighten children into prayer. But to those who have seen him rip open reality with a gesture, who have felt air crackle with the static charge of failure and damnation, the truth is far darker. The fall of an empire does not always begin with legions. Sometimes it begins with one being walking out of the immaterium, carrying a name that mortals should never speak. This is the story of that ruin, the gentle unraveling, the quiet collapse, the moment a single demon prince reminded humanity that the warp does not need armies, only opportunities. If tales like this stir something in you, that mixture of dread, awe, and impossible curiosity, then remain with us. Lend your strength to the Chronicle by offering your support, your voice, and your presence. Like, share, and subscribe so that these forbidden histories may continue to find those brave enough to hear them. The first omen did not arrive with fire, trumpets, or any spectacle the administratum would have recognized as an emergency. It came instead as a subtle folding of silence across the frontier world of Hadrianfu, a faint distortion in the morning air that only the most sensitive souls noticed, and even then they dismissed it as exhaustion, as the lingering echo of troubled dreams. At first light, when the manufactorum sirens usually wailed the signal for another day of labor, they instead sputtered with a strange static murmur that technicians could not trace to any malfunction. The sky above the eastern plains darkened in a way that did not match the system's charts, thinning the sunlight into a dull metallic glow that made even the crops appear sickly beneath it. Astropaths in the capital awoke screaming, clutching their heads as if invisible claws had raked across their minds, and their attendants whispered that some cried a name none dared to record. Vox channels across the lower hive levels began to drift in and out of impossible frequencies, snatches of broken words repeating in patterns that chilled operators to the bone. One claimed he heard his own voice echoing back at him, speaking lines he had never uttered. Even the animals sensed it. Packs of pharaoh wolves abandoned their usual territories, roaming the outskirts restlessly, and the sky birds that nested in the hab spires refused to land, circling in agitated spirals until they exhausted themselves and fell. Most citizens brushed off these irregularities with the indifference of people who live on the edge of the Imperium's vast and uncaring frontier. But the closer one stood to the world's spiritual infrastructure, the harder it became to deny that something was shifting, something vast, patient, and hungry. Adeptus Mechanicus adepts reported that their machine spirits were growing temperamental, spitting out error messages in languages older than the forge records themselves. A senior engine seer swore he saw a schematic rearrange itself spontaneously, the glowing lines on his data slate twitching like veins under skin. Priests of the Ministorum felt their prayers drag heavier on the tongue, as if the air itself resented their invocations, and the candles on the altars guttered without any wind present, their flames bending toward the same distant point on the horizon. The governor, an aging man more devoted to compliance reports than superstition, dismissed all concerns as mass nerves and vox interference. Yet even he could not explain why the great portrait of the emperor in his audience hall began to crack along the eyes, the fissures running like tears of dried gold. Civilians, meanwhile, whispered among themselves about the thinning nights, how the darkness felt different, almost textured, as though something immense was pressing its face against the membrane of reality, watching. A young woman working the night shift at a relay station claimed she saw lights moving in the clouds above the manufactorum, not like aircraft but like drifting lanterns sinking slowly toward the ground. A veteran of the Astra Militarum, stationed planetside while awaiting reassignment, reported dreams that felt less like dreams and more like warnings, crimson deserts stretching into infinity, titanic shadows shifting beneath the sand, and a voice, soft, persuasive, almost compassionate, whispering that the world had been chosen. He told no one, fearing the commissar's suspicion, yet he woke each morning with the taste of ash in his mouth. Warp fluctuations around the system worsened throughout the week, enough that astropathic messages had to be repeated 3 times to transmit without corruption, and even then, fragments were missing, entire phrases swallowed by invisible static. Some messages returned with additions the senders swore they never wrote, strange poetic lines hinting at inevitability, at supplication, at return. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica sealed entire chambers for containment, but walls, no matter how sanctified, cannot stop the warp from brushing against mortal thought. By the 8th day, children in the lower hive had begun drawing the same symbol without having seen it before, a jagged curve intersected by a vertical stroke, simple enough to dismiss as nonsense, yet repeated with uncanny consistency. Their parents scrubbed the markings from walls and floors, but the children simply drew them again with the same calm detachment, as though copying an image placed gently inside their minds. Meanwhile, the air itself took on a faint metallic scent, like blood watered down and left to dry on iron plates beneath a sun that refused to shine properly anymore. Even the most faithful citizens, those who attended shrine rites each evening, found themselves glancing nervously toward the doors, certain that someone or something stood outside listening. A subtle pressure settled over the planet, not enough to cause pain, but heavy enough that people moved slower, breathed shallower, and spoke in hushed voices without realizing why. It was the pressure of inevitability, of destiny being rewritten by invisible hands. And though no tears in reality had yet formed, no demonic silhouette had stepped through the veil, the planet already knew, deep in the ancestral memory that every human carries from Terra's primordial past, that a predator had fixed its gaze upon them. A single demon prince does not announce his approach with armies. He announces it with omens, with tremors in the warp, with quietness so profound it becomes a warning in itself. And on Hadrian IV, the first omen had already come and gone, unnoticed by most, unheeded by all, but felt by every living thing in ways too subtle to measure and too ancient to misunderstand. Something had marked the world. Something was coming. Something that did not need legions, only a doorway. And then, without warning, the warp storms at the edge of the system flared so violently that the sky itself rippled, a brief shimmer that sent birds crashing into windows and made newborns cry as though they recognized the shape of the unseen threat. Astropathic messages ceased entirely for 3 full hours, an impossibility, even in heavy distortion. When the channel opened again, it transmitted nothing but a single ragged breath, followed by a low resonant sound that every astropath felt inside their skull rather than in their ears, a sound that felt like a word but could not be spoken. Panic swept through the Skolam districts, where instructors struggled to keep control as students whispered about nightmares they had all shared, dreams of a towering figure walking across a desert of burning glass, each footstep causing distant cities to collapse like rotting towers of bone. Administratum scribes began failing their daily quotas, hands shaking too badly to write. Tech priests found that their mechadendrites twitched involuntarily whenever they approached certain consoles, as if the machine spirits recoiled from contact. Even the enforcers patrolling the lower hive noticed the change in atmosphere. Citizens spoke faster, looked over their shoulders more often, and flinched at noises that would not have startled them a week before. Crime spiked without reason, brawls erupting over simple misunderstandings, neighbors accusing neighbors of heresy, whole blocks barricading themselves in because someone claimed they heard chanting coming from the vents. And still, beneath the chaos, the presence remained patient. It did not need to act directly, it only needed to nudge, to push, to tap lightly against the weak points of human structure until cracks formed on their own. As the 10th day approached, the governor himself began showing signs of strain. He stared too long at the cracked portrait of the emperor, as if expecting the fissures to spread, and he was overheard asking his adjutants whether they felt as though the world were tilting. One night he summoned the high priest, the regimental commander, and the chief engineer to his chambers, demanding answers none could give. They argued until dawn, their voices muffled behind the thick chamber doors. And when they emerged, each looked older, drained, brittle, and defeated. The sense of unraveling had become unmistakable, a silent crescendo building beneath every moment, tightening around the throat of the planet like a garrote woven from warp light. Something was pushing the world toward crisis, bending its structures, its systems, its people, toward a single inevitable point of collapse. A demon prince does not need to break order. He only needs to watch as mortals do it for him. The first systems to fail were the ones no citizen ever thought about, the quiet arteries of civilization that usually hummed in perfect obedience beneath the world's surface. But on Hadrian IV, these arteries began to pulse unevenly, as though some unseen hand had reached into the planet's infrastructure and pressed its thumb against the flow. It began with a flicker in the primary grid, a momentary blackout that lasted no more than a breath, yet long enough for people in the upper hive to see, for just an instant, their own reflections in the glass shift as though staring back from a different angle. Administratum clerks blamed dust storms, faulty coils, or the antique nature of frontier circuitry, but the excuses deteriorated faster than the systems themselves. Vox relays stuttered and looped, sending officers half-completed orders that contradicted one another, and no matter how many times tech adepts recalibrated the conduits, the machine's spirits refused to settle. Entire manufactorum districts began receiving supply directives they were never meant to get, prompting workers to assemble parts no one had requested while ignoring the ones desperately needed. Cargo haulers sat idle on landing pads, engines hot and whining, awaiting clearance codes that came hours late or arrived corrupted beyond recognition, and the longer they sat, the more the pilots felt an irrational unease, as though staying grounded was somehow safer than taking to the skies. In the barracks, regimental scribes argued over deployment charts that kept rewriting themselves, data streams flickering with symbols that did not belong to any known imperial lexicon. Some of the younger soldiers laughed it off, claiming their cogitators were simply suffering from age, but the veterans watched in silence, remembering other worlds and other campaigns where the warp had begun its whispering in exactly the same way. The governor, determined to maintain order, held emergency councils that descended quickly into suspicion and argument. The Adeptus Mechanicus accused the Administratum of mishandling infrastructure. The Administratum accused the Ministorum of stirring panic with their increasingly desperate sermons. The Ministorum accused everyone else of failing in faith. Their voices rose, their tempers flared, and beneath all of it lingered the same quiet truth. None of them knew what was happening. Warriors of the Astra Militarum tried to uphold discipline, drilling in parade yards whose shadows stretched unnaturally long even during midday, shadows that bent at odd angles as if cast by invisible structures. Officers barked orders with metallic strain in their throats, their words often drowned out by sudden, inexplicable bursts of vox static that rang inside helmets like someone screaming just behind them. Psychers assigned to the regiment began to show signs of strain. Some stared at walls for hours, The breach did not erupt with the cataclysmic spectacle the hololiths of distant wars often depict. Instead, it crept into existence like a wound that had always been there, waiting beneath the skin of reality for the slightest pressure to split it open. It began in the wastelands north of the capital, a region few visited except for survey teams and wandering scavengers, a barren stretch of cracked stone and rust-colored dunes where even the wind seemed tired of moving. A patrol from the Astra Militarum, dispatched to investigate strange seismic readings, reported that the ground felt warm under their boots despite the evening chill, as if something deep beneath the crust had begun to stir. They found no quake, no sinkhole, no evidence of geological instability, only a shallow depression in the sand that had not been there the week before, perfectly circular, its surface polished smooth like glass. The sergeant ordered his squad to keep their distance, but one of the younger troopers stepped closer, compelled by a fascination he could not explain. As he approached the depression, the Vox unit on his belt screeched with static so violent it drew blood from his ears and he collapsed, convulsing, eyes rolled back as though watching something through the veil. The squad dragged him away, but the damage was done. His breathing steadied after several minutes. Yet he never regained full consciousness, murmuring endlessly about a doorway of red sand and a voice learning his name. By the time the squad returned to base, the entire outpost had begun experiencing auditory disturbances, whispers crawling through the Vox lines even when disconnected, drifting in and out like hesitant intruders testing the boundaries of a home they intended to enter. Tech priests inspected the equipment, only to recoil as the machine spirits responded with terrified wails, refusing to cooperate, their digital hymnals corrupted with pulses of sound that did not belong to any Mechanicus frequency. The outpost's senior psyker, sensing a pattern in the disturbances, reached out cautiously with her mind to assess the source. But the moment her consciousness brushed the edge of the presence lurking beyond the physical world, she screamed so loudly that the enamel on her teeth cracked. Her attendants attempted to restrain her, but she fought like a creature possessed, begging them to close the mouth before it learns to speak. She died 3 hours later, lungs bursting from internal pressure as if something inside her skull had crushed her from within. The report was sent to the governor, but by then, Hadrian IV had already begun to tilt toward catastrophe. It started with a single thunderclap that shook the entire hemisphere, though no storm clouds filled the sky. Civilians stumbled, plates fell from shelves, lights flickered violently, and then, for exactly 7 seconds, gravity wavered. People felt themselves lifted a fraction off the ground, as though the world had exhaled beneath them. Children floated inches above their beds before the force slammed back into place, dropping them hard enough to bruise. Meanwhile, on the wasteland's edge, the circular depression split open along its perfectly smooth surface, revealing a thin violet seam pulsing with faint inner light. It widened slowly at first, then faster, as if responding to the planet's sudden gravitational lurch. Desert creatures fled in a frenzy, their shrieks echoing across the dunes. Survey drones sent to capture data returned corrupted, transmitting only glimpses of distorted shapes rising from the breach's glow, shadows that shifted fluidly, as though not yet fully tethered to physical form. The Mechanicus demanded the site be quarantined, but before an agreement could be reached, the first true tear occurred. A column of warp light erupted from the depression, a silent torrent of colorless fire that twisted into impossible geometries before collapsing inward, leaving behind a deep crater rimmed with crystallized sand. At its center, a gash hung in the air, neither vertical nor horizontal, but oriented according to a logic that mocked human senses. The breach pulsed, swelling and contracting like a beating heart, and with each pulse, the temperature around it dropped sharply enough to frost nearby rocks. When the first figures emerged, they were not fully formed, half shapes, silhouettes wavering like heat haze, their bodies flickering in and out of coherence as if reality itself were rejecting them. The Astra Militarum unit assigned to guard the perimeter opened fire immediately, laser guns stitching lines of energy across the shapes, but the beams bent mid-flight as though repelled by unseen currents, dissolving before they ever reached their targets. One of the shapes drifted closer, and the troopers heard a low, resonant sound reverberate inside their helmets, not through the vox, not through the air, but directly into the bones of their skulls. 3 soldiers collapsed, blood streaming from their noses, their eyes dilating into full blackness before they died. The remaining troopers attempted to fall back, but the sand beneath their boots rippled like water, slowing their retreat, tugging at their feet as if urging them to stay. Only the intervention of a chimera transport allowed a handful to escape, its engines roaring defiantly despite the warp energy clawing at its hull, leaving deep gouges along the armor as it sped away. Back in the capital, alarms blared, but the panic was not contained to military channels. Civilians felt the breach's presence like a pressure behind their thoughts, a throbbing awareness of something vast and predatory now peering directly into their world. Infants screamed inconsolably for hours. Old men wept without understanding why. Even animals in the upper hive shrieked and flung themselves against walls, desperate to escape something their instincts recognized far more clearly than their owners. The breach widened steadily over the next hour, crackling with arcs of warp lightning that shattered stones and scorched the ground. And then, when its edges reached the width of a transit shuttle, it stabilized, its surface smoothing into a mirror-dark plane through which the stars themselves seemed to twist. The air thickened, the soundscape fell silent, and every living thing across Hadrian IV felt the same cold certainty settle into its bones. Something on the other side had stopped waiting. It was stepping through, not an army, not a legion, but something worse, one will, one mind, one soul forged in damnation and war. A demon prince had found its doorway, and now the world would learn its name. The storm did not descend upon the empire like a bolt from the heavens. It rose from within, unfurling in slow, hungry coils, tightening around the world as though reality itself were being squeezed by an invisible fist. And everywhere the air began to taste like iron and distant thunder as the devouring spiral awakened from the depths of the breach. It started as a subtle vibration in the bones of the world. Animals pacing in circles until their paws bled, ancient trees bending toward an unseen focal point, oceans forming whirls so vast they were visible from mountaintops. Yet none of these were understood in time, for the spiral was not merely a phenomenon, but an intelligence, a patient predator older than creation, born from the unlit spaces between dying stars, and its emergence into the mortal plane marked the turning of an age. As the spiral expanded, it warped the empire's borders not through conquest, but through consumption. Villages vanished overnight, leaving only concentric rings scorched into the soil. Rivers reversed their flow as if dragged upward by the sky. Whole caravans were found frozen in place, bodies twisted toward the direction of the spiral as though worshipping it in their final moments. And across the capital, the whispered oracles began screaming in unison, their voices shredding from the inside as they proclaimed that the spiral was not invading. It was remembering its claim. The emperor, pale from sleepless nights and bruised with dread, summoned his war council. Though even the most seasoned generals flinched at the maps laid before them, maps now warped into spiraling patterns as though ink itself feared the coming ruin. Scouts reported that the spiral was feeding on more than land and life, devouring time, erasing hours from the memory of those who approached its edge, and the empire's chronomancers, keepers of the sun machines, fell to their knees as they discovered missing days, entire weeks swallowed without trace. As panic erupted among the people, cults of the spiral began to form in secret, claiming to receive visions promising salvation through surrender. These cultists, eyes glazed and mouths marked with spiraling sigils, wandered from house to house preaching that the world was not ending but correcting itself. And those who listened too long found themselves entranced, walking willingly toward the spiral's edge and dissolving into living dust. Among the chaos, the Arcanum order fractured further as scholars argued whether the spiral was an inevitable cosmic cycle, a punishment for the breach, or an entity being summoned by traitors within the Empire. Their debates turned to violence when Master Thalos attempted to seal the spiral using forbidden runes, only to be torn apart by a vortex that formed mid-air and collapsed into nothingness as quickly as it appeared. Meanwhile, the breach, still pulsing like a wound at the world's core, began to fluctuate, opening in wider and more violent intervals, releasing waves of distortion that caused shadows to detach from their owners and crawl along walls like living things, whispering in languages no throat should produce. Even the sky seemed to unravel, constellations shifting into spirals, moons flickering like candles in a storm, and daylight fading at random as though the sun were being partially devoured. In the midst of terror, Lysandra, haunted by her role in the breach, felt the spiral pulling at her with a familiarity that chilled her. She alone heard the spiral's heartbeat in her dreams, felt its tendrils brushing against her consciousness, calling her not as an enemy, but as an heir to the ruin she had unleashed. She fled the capital before dawn, pursued by both loyalists and zealots, carrying with her forbidden knowledge stolen from the Arcanum vaults, a map of the spiral's growth and a prophecy long buried that spoke of a devouring crown, a chosen one who could either command the spiral or be consumed by it. The prophecy hinted that the spiral's hunger was not aimless. It was searching, selecting, aligning the world for an event known only as the Great Convergence, a moment when the boundary between all realms would collapse into a single spiraling core. As Lysandra raced toward the mountains, earthquakes rippled through the land, splitting ancient temples in half, pulling entire forests into spiraling sinkholes that plunged into darkness without echo. Survivors reported seeing colossal shapes moving within the spiral's center, shapes with too many limbs, eyes blinking like lanterns across twisted flesh, as though something vast was forming itself from the collected matter of everything it devoured. Across the Empire, survivors clung to fragments of hope while the spiral grew stronger, feeding on fear and memory, weaving itself into the fabric of existence. Even the air shimmered with its influence, bending light into spectral rings and turning sound into low, resonant hums that vibrated through the ribs of anyone near. And yet, in this descent toward annihilation, a strange calm settled. A deceptive stillness, as if the spiral had paused to inhale before delivering its final, annihilating breath. And the world held itself on the edge of trembling silence, unaware that the true catastrophe had not yet begun, for the spiral was only preparing the stage for something far older, far hungrier, and far more impossible than any mortal nightmare dared imagine. The Empire had always believed itself eternal, an unbroken lineage of rulers, monuments, and myths towering across the ages like a spine of stone holding the world together. But as the devouring spiral tightened its unseen grip, what remained of that proud civilization began to crumble not only in body but in memory, slipping away as though history itself were being rewritten by an indifferent hand. And in the ghostly twilight that now blanketed the land, its once glorious cities became hollow echoes of their former splendor, their marble gates whispering with winds that carried fragments of forgotten voices, their streets dissolving into spirals of dust where crowds once gathered for festivals of fire and song. Within the capital, the citadel of crowns, symbol of imperial might, stood fractured, its highest tower bent at an impossible angle, as though bowed in reluctant submission to the cosmic force encroaching upon it. In its shadow, citizens wandered with vacant expressions, clutching memories that slipped through their minds like sand, trying desperately to recall faces, names, songs, even their own lineage, for the spiral fed upon recollection as easily as it consumed matter, erasing the empire not only from existence, but from remembrance. The emperor, once a figure of unyielding authority, now resembled a ghost trapped inside his own throne room, pacing beneath vaulted ceilings that flickered with temporal distortions. He spent sleepless nights murmuring to portraits of his ancestors, trying to hold on to the stories of his bloodline, yet even those painted faces seemed to shift subtly when he looked away, as if the spiral's influence reached back through generations, unraveling the threads of time itself. The imperial archivists, desperate to preserve what little they could of their heritage, attempted to inscribe history onto obsidian tablets rumored to resist all magic, but even the carved runes began reorganizing themselves into spiraling symbols that no scholar recognized. Libraries collapsed inward as scrolls crumbled into fine black powder, releasing whispers of ancient ink that drifted into the air like morning smoke, and halls once filled with study now echoed only with the hollow hum of time thinning. Across the land, statues dedicated to heroes and gods cracked open, revealing hollow centers as if the stone had forgotten what shape it was supposed to hold, and pilgrims wept as sacred shrines dissolved between blinks, leaving behind nothing but circular scorch marks that pulsed faintly with heat. Musicians found their instruments producing distorted melodies they had never learned, songs bending into spiraling harmonics that resonated through bone and memory, while children born in these days carried strange birthmarks resembling spirals, their first cries harmonizing eerily with the tremors shaking the earth. Even nature mirrored the empire's unraveling. Fields turned to spiraling labyrinths of ash, storms formed in circular patterns that lingered motionless for days, and the sky rippled with fractures through which faint silhouettes of other realms flickered like distant lanterns. Yet amidst the disintegration of all that had once been stable, a strange chorus emerged, echoes not of despair, but of stubborn survival, as pockets of citizens banded together in forgotten corners of the empire, preserving what fragments of culture they could through spoken word, ritual, and defiant remembrance. In the remote fortress city of Ethros, a group of elders gathered nightly to recount stories passed down for centuries, locking arms as they chanted sagas older than their bloodlines, their voices creating a rhythmic pulse that pushed back the spiral's influence for brief moments, like lanterns flickering defiantly against an encroaching storm. In the desert provinces, nomadic tribes etched their histories onto the shells of colossal sand beasts, believing the creatures immune to temporal erosion, and marched northward in long caravans, singing hymns that echoed across the dunes like the heartbeat of a fading world. Far above these struggling enclaves in the shattered peaks of the Skyreach Mountains, Lysandra watched the empire unravel beneath her like a tapestry being pulled apart, thread by thread. The weight of her knowledge pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat, for she now understood the spiral not merely as an entity, but as a mirror held to the empire's sins, an echo of every forgotten oath, every silenced voice, every prophecy dismissed in arrogance. And the more she studied her stolen maps and fractured prophecies, the more she realized that the empire's collapse was not the spiral's ultimate goal, but merely the first verse in a much older song. Below her, scattered fires flickered across the land, villages resisting the pull of oblivion, and their faint lights reminded her painfully of the empire's early days, when unity had been forged through shared hardship rather than enforced obedience. She wondered if perhaps the spiral was stripping the world bare not out of malice, but necessity, peeling away centuries of decay to expose something raw, something essential, something long buried beneath the empire's stone foundations. Yet even as she wrestled with this possibility, the spiral's influence deepened, time loops manifested across the plains, trapping whole battalions in endless cycles of their final moments. While in the far west, an entire port city reportedly folded in on itself like a collapsing star, leaving only a faint ringing sound that persisted for hours. And in the capital, the emperor, driven to the brink of madness, ordered the forging of the echo blades, crystalline swords designed to anchor memory through resonance, hoping to arm his dwindling forces against the intangible enemy consuming their reality. But weapons crafted from desperation rarely obey their makers. The first echo blade shattered upon activation, releasing a wave of memory so potent that soldiers fell to their knees, overwhelmed with visions of ancestors they had never met, while the second blade melted into liquid light that dripped upward toward the sky and vanished. As the empire spiraled further into dissolution, its people clung to one final belief: that echoes, though faint, can outlast even the collapse of worlds. And so they whispered their names into the wind, carved promises into stone that was already turning to sand, sang lullabies to children who might never grow old, and lit lanterns in spirals along their rooftops, each glow a tiny defiance against the cosmic hunger encircling them. And across the mountains, Lysandra felt their echoes, soft, trembling, persistent, resonating within her like a call to action, reminding her that even in ruin, even in vanishing, the empire still had a voice. And though the world teetered on the cusp of annihilation, the echoes of its people formed a fragile, luminous thread, stretching across the dark and pulling her toward a destiny she could no longer outrun.